And we're live. It is Friday, June 27th, the year of our Lord 2025. And it turns out, I didn't know this when I woke up this morning, that I have several things to say about the 27th of June. The first of them is courtesy of the estimable John Hawkinson, who informs me in the chat that June 27th is the National Day of Djibouti. So happy Djibouti Day to all who celebrate. I'm verklempt with emotion about the National Day of Djibouti. The more important thing I want to say about this this day is that it brings up the subject of conflicts of law to me. Because back in 2017, in a resolution adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, the General Assembly of the United Nations declared June 27th Micro and Small and Medium Enterprises Day. And you may be wondering what micro, small and medium-sized enterprises day is. But as the General Assembly on its useful webpage on the subject describes, it comes at a pivotal moment just ahead of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in Seville and the 2nd World Summit for Social Development in Doha. Amid shifts in the global trading landscape, it offers timely opportunity to spotlight the vital role of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in driving inclusive growth and sustainable development, and to catalyze the finance and support and enabling conditions these enterprises need to thrive. And so I was really all ready to celebrate with you International Micro, Small, and Medium-sized Enterprises Day when I stumbled upon UN Resolution 79-294, adopted, as best as I can tell, just a few days ago, which declares today, the 27th of June, the International Day of Deafblindedness, a distinct disability requiring specialized support and inclusion. Deafblindedness is a combined vision and hearing impairment of such severity that it is hard for the impaired senses to compensate for each other, and thus a distinct disability with its own challenges, barriers, and requirements for support and inclusion, different from those provided to individuals who are solely deaf and blind. Now, I want to point out that this resolution was passed without reference to or repeal of the previous Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprises Day declaration, which means this is both. And the forces of inclusion of deafblindedness and the forces of, keeping micro, small, and medium-sized businesses in our minds and hearts are gonna have to duke it out. And it's gonna be like the, is it Nakba Day or Israeli Independence Day, right? Is it
We're starting spicy, I see.
yeah,
Okay.
is it
Let's talk about that.
you've got your so you've got a lot of background noise, so keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. So I just want to say, folks, in the UN General Assembly, you gotta choose here. I mean, June 27th can be Micro, Small, and Independent Businesses Day, And look, Nastia is joining us from a small and independent coffee shop in Kiev. I am a big supporter
It's
of.
actually not. It's Musafir. It's a very
Oh, okay.
large.
So it's
It's the Crimean
large and
Tatar restaurants. Yeah.
it might maybe count as a medium-sized business, but um, uh, I am all for June 27th being International Micro, Small, and Independent Businesses Day. And the other side of me, which really believes in inclusion for deafblind people, and notice that I haven't made a single joke here about deafblindedness because I don't believe in joking about disabilities. And, guys, I'm for June 27th being International Deafblindness Inclusion Day and recognizing it as a separate disability worthy of its own forms of inclusion. I want to tell you, I feel a certain whiplash between seeing adjacent press releases from the United Nations General Assembly declaring June 27th International Deafblindness Day and International Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Businesses Day. Folks, you got to choose. I know they both have their constituencies, but it diminishes small, micro, and medium-sized businesses to have to share this day, and it diminishes International Deafblindness Day to have to share this day uh, with all the small, micro, and medium-sized independent businesses all over the world, every single one of which was gearing up to celebrate June 27th as their very own. So, my word to the UN General Assembly, sometimes it's a time for choosing. You got the deaf-blind over here, you got the small, independent, medium-sized micro businesses over here. Take a stand, guys. Folks, the sun is not shining in Washington. It is cloudy, overcast. It rained all night. The temperature plummeted. It is now down in the 70s, or as Nastia would say, down into the low mid 20s. It is comfortable and cool.
It's the
It
same in
is
Kyiv. It's so good.
Yeah, it's gorgeous here. It is wet. It is, I know people don't like this word, so I like to use it. It is moist outside. Um, and um, and the birds are chirping. It is gonna be a great fucking day. And I put on a Vishivanka because when Nastia joins us and it's just the two of us, it is kava vino. Here it is. Here's the kava. Where's the
Here's
oh,
more kava.
it's more kava. So
It's just kava and kava.
kava is the Ukrainian word for coffee. Vino, of course, is the international word for wine. Um, but when you say it in Ukrainian, you got to make the e like what would be in Italian v. You got
No,
to
you're
do
actually wrong. That's the Russian.
no, you got to do it in the back of your throat, so it's more like the.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. Yes.
and Vino, because otherwise you come out sounding like a Russian. Um, and um,
And we don't want that.
and we don't want that, even if we're native Russian speaking like Nastia. Um, and
People on this show know how I feel about this.
um, and look, folks, um, you're watching Dog Shirt TV, and it is a goddamn revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features, of which there are many, is that sometimes I take off the dog shirt, put on a Vishivanka, and it's kava et vino. And sometimes I get excited because there's a conflict of law in UN General Assembly resolutions. Um, and we have an amusing bit of comedy that arises out of the UN General Assembly's sudden need to recognize a new constituency in the face of a long-standing recognition of an old constituency. we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Nastia join us in the middle of a rant about the UN General Assembly. Nastia, hi.
Hello.
Did you
Is
get
my
any sleep
sound
last
really
night?
terrible or is it okay?
No, you're okay. You got some people in the background. Um, oh, and one other thing, I completing yesterday's conversation, I turned on Instagram this morning and immediately got uh, a a reel from uh, an influencer who was trying to teach me how to speak English, who tried to inform me of the difference between being in a cafe and at a cafe. And I flatter myself that I speak and write English pretty well. Have to say, I think she was wrong about which the difference in the usage. I think there is zero difference in the usage. But Nastia, are you in a cafe or at a cafe?
Somehow when I say restaurant, I have to say at a restaurant. That comes more natural to me. It seems weird to say in a restaurant. But at versus in a cafe, I don't care much. But I can say at. I'm at Musafir. This is the Crimean we're talking about this because you know, but for people who don't know, which most of you don't, Musafir is a chain of Crimean Tatar restaurants in Ukraine. There are four of them in Kyiv. And the chef at one of those locations is my mother-in-law. And she's only a chef in one location, but really it's the only good one, and the rest of them suck. So she's the main chef of the chain, I prefer to say. So it's very nice.
All right.
I
So
can't wait until Ben comes here to eat all of it.
what characterizes Crimean Tatar food? What makes it different from uh, other Ukrainian food, and what makes it different from other regional Turkic foods, like, say, uh, Turkish food?
So the difference between Crimean Tatar and Turkish food is going to be tricky for me to formulate because I actually don't know. You're going to have to ask Eric, or I'll have to ask Eric, my husband. But with the Ukrainian, it's pretty much completely different. Like the entire menu here, apart from like a Greek salad, what I just had, it's all like very very specific. Or there are a few things that are the same thing, but they have like their own communitas or name for it, like the stuffed peppers, you know, like the bell pepper that you stuff with meat and rice. That's like a normal thing for Ukrainians to make, but Crimean Tatars have their own name and version of that, and you know. But pretty much everything else is like very specific. But it's pretty typical of like what you'd see at a Turkish restaurant, I think.
So
It's mostly
a lot of grilled
yeah,
meat.
kebabs. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Um, there's a cool kind of mix between Georgian foods and pizza, which they call pide, but I think that's also Turkish or also
Yep.
existing in the right? It's like the how do you explain it?
It's an elongated
Yeah,
flatbread that's covered
yes,
with things.
yes,
But
it's
I
so
think in
good. It's
Turkish you would
yes,
also call that a pide.
yes. Okay, so they have a pide. Um, I don't know. It's all to me Crimean Tatar food, but then I talked to my husband about it, and he's like, "Yeah, it's pretty much like the Turkish food is very similar." Well, because they have they have so much shared culture, right? So
Right.
it's these things. It's like who owns hummus? Like, let's have that conversation. It's the same. It's sort of the same thing. You recently
Everybody
told
owns
me,
hummus except me because it will kill me. And tahini.
really?
Yeah, I'm allergic to sesame seeds. They'll both finish me
Jesus.
off pretty fast. Um,
Okay. When you come here, I want us to go. It's not that I just want us to go. I will make sure that we go to one of the fancy Israeli restaurants here because we have a big Jewish presence and we have actually a good number of Israeli restaurants. And considering that you told me that there is no such thing as Israeli street food, I need, I need to take you to the restaurant
Well,
and see you react
there's a
to the
lot of
menu.
Israeli street food in the sense of street food that's for sale in Israel. There's just very little Israeli street food that is distinct from Lebanese street food, Jordanian street food, Egyptian street food, Palestinian street food. All of this cuisine is a
Yeah.
regional thing, and the distinctly Israeli side of it is a lot of it is, these addendums to it that were brought to the region by um, Jews from mostly Ashkenazic countries because the Sephardic and Middle Eastern countries had some variant of a lot of the food. So Israeli food it's kind of got an American vibe. It's a sort of mishmash of all these different cultures that came there. But the distinction is um, uh, the dominant presence is a Middle Eastern, is a kind of regional Levantine, um, uh, uh, that is kind of, it's less like a Turkish food, and so it's more like what you would see in Lebanon.
Yeah, I mean, like we go to one of those places that's near our house, and they'd have on the menu like different types of bread because there's you guys have like a million types of different breads, and one of them would be like the Palestinian bread, and I would buy it to show my political support for Palestine. But anyway, but that just proves the point of like it's all a mix.
So did you get any sleep last night?
Yeah, there wasn't anything bad in Kiev. There were a few drones here and there, some explosions, but very distant. No mass attack. There were still hundreds of drones attacking Ukraine, but they weren't attacking Kiev. They were
Right.
attacking other places. So, yeah. But we'll see what happens tonight, and then on Monday, because they have a thing for Mondays.
And you said you think the thing for Monday is really about screwing up the week prospectively. Are you serious about that, or is that a joke?
I don't know if that's why they're doing it, but that's certainly the consequence. Definitely for me, like, if my Monday night is fucked, then I feel like my fall week is gonna be May, which, I've told you I've been kind of not very productive the past few weeks, mainly because of the look at.
Hmm.
And then some of my friends feel the same way, that it's like once they don't have any sleep on Monday, they're trying to recover for the rest of the work week. But I don't know why they do it, but you know, they do genuinely have a thing for Mondays, like early morning Monday. Um, you know, they do some of these attacks. I don't know why, but
Um,
yeah.
all right. So what's
I
on
have a
the agenda?
question.
What's on the agenda today?
What's the agenda today?
I mean, for the
Uh,
show.
yeah, right, yeah. I mean, we could talk about the NATO summit, which is actually more dramatic than it sounds for people in the audience.
Yeah, so
Uh,
let's start there. President
yeah,
Trump went to the NATO summit. He emerged a
right.
convert, shocked that NATO leaders seem to actually love their countries and that the whole thing is not a scam, I believe is a direct quote. And the
Jesus. Okay.
Secretary General of NATO appears to have called Trump daddy, which
Yep,
um,
that happened.
which has got to be a historic first. Though to be honest, I didn't look at whether the first NATO Secretary General after the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty called the president daddy on signature. But that would be a surprise to me. Um, what do you make of it? Also, Trump came away suggesting that he might send y'all some new Patriot interceptors.
Yeah, that would be great.
Are you going to put them in your living room?
No, because it's gonna be fucking loud. So, but yeah, I was writing to write my weekly Ukraine briefing for my Substack, so that's why I was thinking about the NATO summit because that's what it's going to be about this time. But it was a really historic summit in many ways. But what I find very notable is that the way the Ukrainians understood it and like how we perceived it, what it means for us, is completely opposite of how the international media is writing about it,
How do you
which is
mean?
very interesting to me. So there was a lot of doom and gloom like leading up to the summit. There were all these rumors that Zelensky might not have even been invited, that there is a lot of conflict between the US and the rest of NATO members around the phrasing of the final communique, the final declaration, which they release after every summit annually. The US wanted it to be more chill in regards to Russia, and the rest of the NATO members wanted it to be very sort of direct. And so the whole planning was very sort of, I mean, it's a very precarious moment for NATO, obviously. Trump doesn't like it, at least that's what he said before. Threatened to leave it, whatever. And so the entire planning process was very sort of scary for Ukraine because the hosts, the Netherlands, and also everyone else involved in the planning basically had to do whatever they could to make Trump happy. Um, and a lot of that meant that essentially they were going to talk a lot less about Ukraine so far, like as much as to say that like we're barely even going to touch the subject, which the Western media sort of translated into, okay, Ukraine is screwed. Like this was a terrible summit for Ukraine. Like, Ukraine is in danger, blah, blah, blah. But that's not at all how the Ukrainian media understood it, which is so interesting. So,
So how did the
I mean,
Ukrainian media
right.
understand it?
So basically, what happened at the summit is that everything was theatered from the formal part of the summit, like the when everyone sits in a room and sort of negotiates about NATO things. That was shortened significantly because people didn't want Trump to get bored because he doesn't actually like keep the job of being president. So they shortened it. The final communique also was significantly shortened. Like it would usually be like texts, like pages and pages of
And it was in all
boring text.
caps and had a lot of exclamation points.
No, it did not. But it was basically a one page, which like I've checked previous declarations. It never happened like this. So the whole thing was just to make Trump happy. And the main discussion was the spending, the how much NATO members are going to spend on defense, right? Like the Trump wanted the 5%. And the whole thing was to show to Trump that like, hey, we can take care of ourselves. You wanted us to spend 5%, we can spend 5%. And so since the full-scale invasion, every year, one way or the other, the summits were about Ukraine. And people would talk about them in that way. People would say that we're here to talk about how we can support Ukraine, how we can deter Russia because Russia is the evil aggressor, blah, blah, blah. And this time there was almost none of that. The whole thing was about European defense and how Europe can step up and everything. But that doesn't mean that it went really badly for Ukraine because in the final communique, which was part of like the disagreement, right? Like the US wanted much softer language and the NATO members wanted much stronger language. The final communique does recognize that, like it mentions Russia. It's not like with some UN shit where they pretend that Russia isn't even a problem. Like they say that Russia is I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it does recognize that Russia is the threat to European security. And it says that European, like NATO members are going to spend 5% on their defense, 3.5 of those 5% on like actual hard like defense weaponry, and 1.5% on like soft defense, meaning like building up your resilience, infrastructure, forts, whatever, things that you can use for defense and that will be important, but are not actually part defense, like weapons. And it says that all of the NATO member contributions to Ukraine, like all of the aid that goes to Ukraine, is going to be written into that 5%, which essentially means that helping Ukraine is now a part of NATO budgeting and NATO planning, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and more importantly, not just NATO planning, but it counts against the obligation by the
Yes,
individual countries to that 5%. And so
exactly.
you can, from a the perspective of Norway, if you don't want to, which has, it creates a huge hole if you say to the Norwegians, you got to spend 5% of your GDP and how do you do that if you're Norway? Well, the answer is just give a shitload of money to Ukraine, right? And
Exactly.
so it creates a real incentive structure that's
Right.
very helpful.
Because like there are a lot of concerns about, well, not concerns, but like it's increasing defense spending is pretty hard economically as well, right? Because you have to do it in a way that doesn't saturate your own economy. You have to, if you are Norway and or some other Nordic country that has a pretty small military, there's only so much money you can kind of pour at it before you actually have to restructure it, right? Like if you just have a small military, you have to figure out where to put that money. And so, yeah, essentially sending it to Ukraine is like bureaucratically, it's much easier to do. Is basically the point. Like it's much easier for any European country to send stuff to us than to figure out what to do with their own weapons production and things like that. So essentially, in Ukraine, it's perceived as a great summit for Ukraine because a lot of the worst possible scenarios didn't happen, right? Like Russia is clearly mentioned as a threat to Europe, as as a problem, and the U.S. signed off on that declaration, so that's good. The funding for Ukraine is clearly written into like NATO's long-term planning. This is like a decade ahead, right? And so, it's the very fact that Europe pledged to spend 5% is a huge deal, right? Like we are a part of Europe. All of this is our thing as well, right? Like we want all of European countries to spend more. So the fact that everything wasn't about Ukraine and rhetoric and people didn't mention Ukraine in every sentence, like it's not that big of a deal because in practice, what happened is actually great for us. Zelensky showed up. He wore a suit, or a thing that looked like a suit, which was really funny. The Counteroffensive published a news flash about it, calling it the most important fashion news you will hear this week or something. Like that was literally the headline. It was hilarious. Um, so yeah, and then I go and I read the New York Times reporting about it, and it's like it was another grim sign for Ukraine about its future. And then I go to the Ukrainian media, and it's like, great summit, we're gonna get aid and money, like everything's good. I'm like,
So
wow.
who do you think is right? I mean, one possibility when you have a contrast between the way Ukrainian media and the rest of the world is covering something, or the way the rest of the American press is covering something, is that you know you've hit a Ukrainian blind spot, right? And you really saw that, for example, when Trump was elected to the second term, and the prevailing view in Ukraine was a kind of weird optimism um,
It's still a problem.
um, about Trump. But sometimes the opposite is the case, that Ukrainians see something that the rest of the world or the American press is missing. Um,
Like Russia, for example.
well, it can be some really big
We
things.
should talk about that.
It can also be some like little things. For example, uh, Ukrainians picked up on the Iranian role in this war in a weeks and weeks and weeks before it was common in the American press, right? Um, and so, like, I actually think when there's a disparity between Ukrainian instincts and coverage of something and mainstream American press instincts about something, it's worth thinking about who's right here.
Because it's
What,
not always one side. Yeah.
right, or who's seeing what that the other side is not seeing. Often it's a combination of the two. How do you assess the summit?
I perhaps perhaps this is just my tribalism and my nationalism or whatnot. But I actually tend to agree with the Ukrainian side. Um, but I don't know, it's hard to understand and to analyze everything that the Trump administration does because it depends on sort of what do you compare it against, right? Like, so I think the Ukrainian understanding of it is because we sort of accepted that this is now the new normal, that Trump is gonna do shit that everyone is shocked by, that like everything is just going into the abyss and we're all fucked. And so against that backdrop, it was a great summit. You know what I mean? Whereas I feel like the New York Times is probably still comparing it to some Biden era, right? Like thing. And in that sense, they would rather talk about how Trump was acting like a king and got king treatment, which is true. And
And
no,
also about the missed opportunities of the summit, right? I mean, you could imagine a
yeah, like
summit
no
in
negotiation breakthrough or something
and
like that.
no great statement of, the great statement is we're all increasing our GDP, defense expenditure to 5% of GDP. The great statement is not, and we're sending, you know, uh, you know, 200, $300 million per month in artillery shells to the Pokrovsk region, right? Like we're not, we're like there's no great statement of support for Ukraine in there.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it does mention something about Ukraine, but of course it's nowhere near the we'll
Notice
support you as long
notice
as
the
it
word
takes.
pretty sure. Like
Yeah,
we can't the
like
takeaway
it's
from the
not
summit
obvious.
is
Yeah,
not a big
yeah,
statement of
yes,
support for Ukraine.
exactly, exactly. Yeah. Um, so yeah, it's pretty interesting. But I mean, you gotta like give credit where credit is due. Like it is sort of historic and extremely important that Europe accepted this, right? The 5% spending. Like that's a huge deal. The fact that it sucks that Trump had to happen to make it happen, right? Like it's something that Ukrainians are sort of really annoyed at. That like it took 4 years of a full-scale war for Europeans to be like, oh my God, we're next. Yeah, duh. We've been saying it since 2022 and even before it, right? Like, so yeah,
I want to
I don't
say
know.
a word in defense of Europe on this point, though I
Please do.
am a nationalistic American who has a lot of anger and contempt for European free riding off of the American security umbrella.
Do you
Um,
genuinely?
yes, I do.
Right.
Um, and I have, um, uh, I mean, I wouldn't blow up the NATO alliance over it. Um, I,
I mean,
I,
it's Trump identifies the right problems but chooses the wrong solutions, is what Ezra
sometimes he
Klein
also
says, and
identifies
I
the wrong
agree.
problems and chooses the wrong solutions. But the idea that that Europe uses the American security umbrella to provide a degree of social safety net that America cannot afford to do, along with providing for the security that it provides, and then complains about American military policies in 100 different areas, is um, to anybody who has to navigate that world infuriating, and it's been infuriating like my entire adult life. Um, and
Oh, I didn't know that.
I do find it incredibly aggravating. Um, Now,
What?
do I think the net plus of our having these alliances is gigantically in excess of the aggravation? Absolutely. Do would I would I do I think NATO is a scam? No. Right? Do I think on balance it is not just worth it, but worth it 100 times over? Yes. But do I share Barack Obama's irritation that you can't get European countries to, um, to pay their own fair share of the cost of collective security? Yeah, I do. And I think it is right for Obama and Biden and Trump to raise that issue on a consistent basis and yell and scream about it. That said, I want to say a word in defense of Europe on this point, which is we created this incentive structure. And if you say, we'll pay for X, we'll take care of X, um, and you don't have to, then you can't complain too loudly when the recipient of that invitation don't have to, and and then push to the extent that they can the limits of what you're requiring them to do. That's the nature of the incentive structure we created. And if the lead actor is Germany, which has um, a historic, uh, for very good reasons, a historical anxiety and constitutional anxiety about using force and, being involved in overseas cross-border military conflicts. Um, you're creating an incentive structure against a real cultural anxiety. And so I think the Europeans, I don't want to let them off the hook here, but their relationship with this question is complicated, and um, complicated in a way that Ukrainians can't entirely understand, and Americans also can't entirely understand. And part of the frustration, frankly, should be directed at us because we created this incentive structure. And so I think it's a complicated everybody's got their weak spots and their strong spots in this conversation. And the key thing to me is, are you at the end of the day committed to two strong propositions? One is that European countries, and American countries for that matter, need to be democratic. Um, and so that means when you're hungry, you're out of the club. And I don't, if you're representing Vladimir Putin, you're out of the club.
They need to
Um,
solve that problem.
yes,
I don't know how, but the EU needs to figure out how to kick people out
they,
because
that's a
it's
they,
a
not a
huge
you.
problem.
Um, because that one's not our problem.
It definitely.
That's a Brussels problem and a European governance problem. But the second is, are you committed to collective security? There are democratic countries in Europe, like Switzerland, that aren't. Um, and that's legit, but they're not part of the club either. And um, and so I think the question, if you are A, committedly democratic, and B, committed to collective security, we got to work together. That's just the end of the conversation. We got to work together, and we got to figure out modus vivendi. And part of that is a certain cultural sensitivity to where other people in the conversation come from. Your thoughts?
I have many thoughts. I, as is usually the case with everything you say, I agree with you. But I am fascinated with like wargaming Russian invasion of something in NATO and how it's gonna go. Um, I read a fascinating piece by our friend Fabian, who's been on this show, I think, before, and he said that um, if Russia decides to test NATO in Article 5, it's going to be nothing like anything. It's going to be at some tiny incursion somewhere, like sort of a Crimea kind of thing, right? Like little green men, but they are actually going to be like Russian special forces or something. They will show up somewhere, I don't know, the Suwalki Gap or Narva, one of those famous scenarios. They will just take a few villages and and then be like, if you try to take it back from us, we'll nuke you. That has worked very well for their deterrence before, right? And so, like, what NATO is gonna do in case of like a minor incursion like that is a really interesting discussion and sort of like a thought experiment for me. I'm in general fascinated with like the next front line, right? Like how the rest of Europe, and not just the rest of Europe, but specifically Nordics and the Baltics, which are on the border with Russia, how they're thinking about this. And I think it's very interesting.
So
So,
there are there's another little scenario which is not about a physical incursion that involves taking and holding territory, but 100 little pinpricks. What if something were shelled in Poland, but it's a one-time deal, right? It's not an act, it's clearly a use of force, but it's not taking territory and holding it. It's you hit something and oops, accident, sorry. Um, um, but then you did it again, right? And so each action is
yeah,
below the threshold that would, and this is,
this
cl-
is,
classic gray zone stuff. Um, it has a, um, it, it's the other way to test, right? Little
it,
pinpricks, and then somebody gets assassinated on British soil again, right? Or an attack in the Tiergarten. These are real cases, right? In Berlin, that's obviously the Russians are behind, but they don't acknowledge it. This is stuff that you know if you do it with far enough, um, the incidents are far enough apart, nobody thinks of it as a test of NATO. But if you create a density of them, 40 such incidents in 6 months or something, 20 such incidents in six
yeah,
months, then it becomes a test, right? And that's the other way. It's the non-territorial way of testing what NATO is about.
it's basically like turning Sullivan's strategy on its head, right? Like it's boiling the frog, but the frog being NATO. And in terms of like the density of it, I've actually been meaning to do that. I want to create a sort of database of like, I have no idea how to do it. I probably need some AI prowess, so I'll talk to Kat. But like gathering the data of all of these incidents like across Europe over some period of time to see like because I feel like once you do that and once you have like a bird's eye view on what's happening, it's pretty bad. It's pretty worrying,
Yes, I think
right?
one of the qualities of it is that each country kind of knows what's happening to it, right? So um if you're in uh
Norway.
Norway, you're very aware of all the Norway incidents, beluga whales that turn into spies and, you know,
Actual spies,
actual
human
spies
spies.
showing up in your universities. Of course, that happens in other places too. Um, but you have a sense of the Norway density. And if you're in Finland, you have a sense of every statement that Dmitry Medvedev has made about, Finland not being a real country and we could take it tomorrow. But, you know,
I
what,
want to see him try.
but what if you're like, looking at the big picture and you're thinking about every gray zone incident that happens everywhere. And remember that gray is a scale, right? There's running spies is completely legitimate. It's something that countries do against each other. And by the way, it's not considered a belligerent act. It's, you know,
Oh,
it's
interesting.
it's not a grounds for war. Countries spy on each other. It's even legal under international law.
What
Um,
about that case of there was the scandal under Obama, right? When they uncovered a whole ring of deep cover Russian spies. People made
yes,
movies about it, and
this was
Republicans
a case that the film, the show, The Americans is
they
based on, and it was
right.
run by the investigation was run, or at least part of the investigation was run by my friend Pete Strzok, and
Oh,
um, but Russia didn't do anything illegal in that case.
but didn't people want Obama to like sanction Russia over it? Like there was some debate about the severity of their response.
Sure. So the like, all right, let's take spying
Sorry,
is not
I
a
opened a
violation.
new tab.
Spying is not a violation of international law. Russia spies on the United States. We spy on Russia. Um, and now the individual activities associated with spying may violate the domestic laws of the country. So both countries have anti-espionage laws. If you're a spy for the United States in Russia, you're going to be violating Russian domestic law. The United States isn't accountable to Russian domestic law, we can't prosecute Russia. And the diplomats the spies they send under diplomatic cover aren't subject to American law either. They have diplomatic immunity and vice versa. So there's a certain acceptance that countries engage in espionage, and you prosecute the people without diplomatic cover who engage in the espionage. So in this case, um, the illegal, what are called the illegals. This was sometimes called the illegals case. And that means that they were not here under diplomatic cover. They were like supposedly secret, and we caught them. So you prosecute them. But then, let's be honest, you trade them for somebody. And in this case, we traded them for, uh, people who had spied for us, spied for the British, um, and and so it's sort of mutually advantageous to trade spies, just as it is mutually advantageous for Ukraine and Russia to trade POWs, right? And so, as a practical matter, the people who get zapped, really screwed for spying, are Americans who spy for Russia and Russians who spy for America, right? People get rightly really angry at their own nationals when they spy, but
Sort of double agents, yeah.
there's nothing illegal about the state act of spying against one another. There are certain states, the Five Eyes, for example, um, which have in common
That's who? That's UK, US,
UK,
France.
US, nope, Canada, um, Australia, New Zealand. So English,
That's so bizarre.
no, it makes total sense.
Who
English
who
speaking
gives a shit
countries who
about
were
New
allies
Zealand?
in World War II and developed deep intelligence relationships during World War II and then maintained them through the Cold War. Um,
Okay. So they
and
don't spy on each other, supposedly.
there is no, really. It's not worth, um,
Okay.
it's
The
not
diplomatic like blow up to do it.
No, it's just it. So if the United States wants information about Britain, we ask,
They can just ask you.
right?
Okay.
Um, and the intelligence sharing is so close that we don't have deep diplomatic or military secrets from one another. This is so extreme that in the case of the UK, when General Hayden, who was then the head of the National Security Agency, was concerned about whether Fort Meade would be after 9/11 would be a target for Al Qaeda, he called his British counterpart and said, if anything happens to Fort Meade, you are in charge of U.S. signals intelligence. Um, so that is how close the British American, and that's why the British. So there are certain countries that have a a deep reservation about spying on each other. They don't include the United States and France. The United States and France do not have that close an intelligence relationship. They don't include the United States and Israel. Israel's famously run an agent against the United States, one who spent, I don't know, 30 years in prison as a result, before being traded back to Israel. So, these are some really intimate security relationships, don't involve this kind of inhibition. It's really unique to the uh, to the Five Eyes situation. The consequence of it is that the inhibition against spying is purely a matter of diplomatic response. If Israel runs agents against the United States gets pissed off, right? And Israel has a limited appetite for really pissing off the United States. So it does it. It did it that one time. It's got caught. It's probably done it a few other times, but I don't know that. But it's not a regular practice. So I would leave the espionage stuff out. I'm talking about physical incursions on territory, bombs falling, like has happened in Poland a couple times during the, probably by accident. But like one way to do what you're talking about, to test NATO, is to do these little pinpricks. One is to try to seize and hold territory in one of the great scenarios that everybody always talks about. But what if you didn't do that? What if a bomb falls in Estonia and, oh, that's a diplomatic matter and we, deal with that. And something falls in Poland and, somebody gets assassinated in France and we deny that, right? And so all over NATO, just things start happening in the physical space, the sovereign territory of
It's
other
already
countries
happening.
that aren't espionage, right?
Yeah.
Espionage, we
Yeah.
have a 2,000-year tradition of knowing how to deal with it, right? But what about the other stuff? Um,
When were you born, Ben?
what's that?
This is really, when were you born?
I was
Like,
born in 1969.
okay.
Why?
So when the Soviet Union fell apart, you were like my age, roughly,
I
right?
was a little bit younger than you. The Soviet Union fell apart right at the end of, well, so it functionally fell apart while I was in college and lost control of Eastern Europe, and all, Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania all kind of break away.
Declared sovereignty and independence and stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. And then a year and a half later, when I was out of college, was the final, the
Ukraine
1992
breaking it.
Ukraine broke the Soviet Union,
Yes,
and
we claimed that too.
yeah, and the so-called Commonwealth of Independent States was declared. Why?
I have recently discovered writings of canon, and my life has changed forever. So I wanted to ask you what you remembered from that time.
Well, I remember it vividly. So I grew up in an era in which we genuinely feared nuclear exchange. That was every child's nightmare. Um, you know,
School drills, all of that.
so we were
A
post-school
scary
drills.
movie was made.
School drills were my parents' age and a little bit younger. But, we had a we definitely thought of the scary thing that could happen as, some miscommunication and there was a nuclear war and we would all die. And that was what we lived with. And, it all seemed extremely permanent. Um, and Gorbachev came to power when I was 15 and in high school. And the excitement over the next few years. So I don't think anybody took Gorbachev too seriously as a reformer until Chernobyl, um, when when he really started doing some dramatic stuff. And
After fucking over Ukraine during the Chernobyl center or
correct,
incident.
correct.
Just putting it up there.
No, but look, I'm not.
So many people died specifically because the Soviets fucked us over.
Yeah, no. I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I am not saying good people or anything like that. I'm saying, um, if you were sitting in Washington in that period, starting in around '86, you really noticed that there was reform happening in the Soviet Union. And by the way, even more dramatically, reform happening in Poland, and that the Soviets weren't doing anything about it, right? In this period of and so over the course of, then you had the Reykjavik summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, and that was impossible to ignore. And so we really, first of all, the internal politics of ethnicities in the Soviet Union was not fully on our radar screen. They, with some degree of success, conveyed the idea of the Soviet Union as a block,
One big blob.
one
Yeah.
big block of
We did
fraternal
an episode
worker
of
ethnic.
podcast about it.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was and so our sense of um, we certainly had a sense of Ukrainian nationalism as a historical thing, right, and Georgian nationalism as a historical thing, but the immediate response was that the Soviet Union was liberalizing, not that the Soviet Union was fracturing along ethnic and historical and decolonization lines. And to the extent that we thought about decolonization at all, which we did, we thought about it in terms of Eastern Europe, not in terms of, and sometimes the Baltics, but not in terms of the internal politics of the Soviet Union itself. And so when I went to college, I studied Russian because I was excited about an era in which we would have a completely different relationship with the Soviet Union. And it never occurred to me that, and I've told you this before, I didn't really understand that Ukrainian was a separate language, was meaningfully a separate language until like a few years ago. It's just not something that and so we were super hyper aware of reform in the Soviet Union, but it was almost all reform in the Soviet Union qua the Soviet Union rather than as a series of countries that had been dominated by Russia since the 18th century or starting in the 18th century that were now asserting their independence. And I don't think we really had a sense of that until, I don't know, 1991, 1992.
It reminds me, it's not an exact like similarity, obviously, because the context is different, but this sort of Western fascination with the Soviet Union, for your generation is what the Middle East is for my generation.
Yes, of course,
Remember,
we
I
had that too. So
like this like far
if you were
away,
Tamara
fascinating
Wittes
land.
instead of Benjamin Wittes, you spent that same time being fascinated by the Middle East in a way that would be very recognizable to your generation, right? So the
I
Middle
mean,
East,
I was gonna learn Arabic, remember? Like before the war, I was gonna go work in Syria or
right?
whatever.
Um, that's been a sort of constant for a long period of time that there are, you know, what what are
Especially when you're young.
traditionally called in the United States Arabists, which which has a weird valence now, but is you know we developed a huge cadre of people who knew about the Middle East. Ooh, it is time to end. One of the things about about Kava Ilina is that it goes really fast, and we always end up talking about Russian imperialism. Um, Nastia, you're a great American, and that was a
I
joke.
wish.
Have a
I
great
wish.
day. And everybody, we will be back on Monday. Um, it's going to be wild and fun.